The gravel sang under the luxury tires before the car cleared the last bend and came into view. It was polished to a mirror, the chrome catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back like a promise. Roberto stepped out, jacket buttoned, shoes immaculate. He moved with the confident economy of a man who had always assumed the world would rearrange itself for him. His hand went to the leather briefcase, as if it were not only his, but the volume of his intentions. On the porch, Clara's apron had a faint streak of tomato soil. A row of wooden stakes held up the vine-heavy plants she insisted on every season. Their green leaves trembled in a breeze that carried the smell of earth and boiling coffee. Antonio sat where he had sat for years, by the kitchen window, hands folded around the papery rim of his mug, looking out at the patchwork of modest roofs and the single mango tree that had been planted the year they moved to this house. Roberto's shadow fell across the threshold before he said anything. He did not knock. He did not pause to take in the small changes of the house he had barely visited in a decade, the faded photograph of a boy on a bicycle propped against an old mantel, a newspaper clipping about a local harvest pinned to the wall, the little dent on the porch step from the day Antonio had dropped a milk crate trying to hold a downpour back from the doorway. "Leave now," he screamed. The sentence landed like a fist. The neighbors hushed in their yards. Mrs. Lourdes from next door, watering her geraniums, straightened and peered over the fence. Two children playing in the alley went quiet and pressed their faces to the gap in the wood. The voice of the man who had flown between continents and sat across conference tables seemed thinner when it broke over the small house and its memories. Clara's hands stilled in the soil. Her face folded once, then twice, as if she were trying to comprehend whether the words had been meant for her at all. Antonio's mug clinked against the saucer. Whatever calm he had cultivated through years of practical labor cracked, but not into fear, into a wary disbelief. Roberto did not lower his voice. He laid the briefcase on the porch and opened it like a display. The papers inside were sterile and embossed, maps of survey lines, a letterhead with the name of the corporation he now represented. He tapped a printed plan where the house stood, red lines slicing through the old foundation. "This land," he said, every syllable clipped, "is worth more than memories. We're building. You'll get an apartment in the new development. He searched for a word that would make eviction sound like advancement. Better. For a moment, the hard edges of his speech were the only sharp things in the scene. Then Clara found voice. It was not the flaring anger the neighborhood half expected. It was a quiet that carried more sorrow than anger ever could. "Better for whom, Roberto?" she asked.
The garden between them, these small, patient rows of life, seemed to answer her. Antonio rose slowly, placing a hand on the back of an old chair as if to steady himself against the irony of standing up to his son in the same porch where years ago he had steadied him. Neighbors leaned from windows. A man across the street folded his newspaper back, face thin with curiosity. News moved fast in small communities, quicker still when blood and land tangled at the edges of a family. Roberto's jaw worked. He had rehearsed this, the numbers, the plans, the future skyline of glass and light. He had rehearsed the tone that would make him unavoidable. But he had not rehearsed the look that came into Clara's eyes when she remembered summer afternoons spent kneeling in that exact plot, hands in soil, humming an old song as she tended the tomatoes that always grew a little crooked, but tasted like the house itself. "You promised to think about it," Roberto said now, as if pity could be administered like a final courtesy. "You promised you'd be reasonable. This is opportunity, my partners." He did not finish the sentence. A figure emerged from behind the fence, small and steady, bearing a plate of biscuits. Mrs. Lourdes set the plate on the step, as if depositing a peace offering. Her hands were knotted the way old women's hands often were, useful, full of found strength. She did not look at Roberto. Her eyes sought Clara's and Antonio's. "There's more to a home than rafters," she said, not loudly, but loud enough for Roberto to hear. Her voice was not the voice of someone who had an axe to grind. It was the voice of a neighbor who had watched the family through births, funerals, and the slow business of paying the light bill. You can't take that kind of place and put it in the palms of a book. Roberto's laugh was brittle. "We're not taking a place, we're developing land. This is how cities grow. This is how you make value." Antonio moved closer to his son. His fingers curled around the banister where years earlier he had painted the peeling wood. The calluses on his hands, the faint scars that run like fingerprints across his thumb, these were the maps of a life spent building and repairing. He had never been comfortable with money speeches. They were theatrical to him, paper substitutes for the honest transaction of labor. "There's a paper you ought to read," Antonio said. He did not raise his voice. "There's a paper with a stamp you want signed, long before any of this glass came into your world. It says the house may not be sold without... Roberto flicked the words away like flies. You don't understand the tax codes, Dad. This is not sentimental. This is capital. You call it capital, Clara said softly, but to us, it's the place where you came home with a scraped knee. It's where we learned to forgive each other when the wiring went and the casseroles were thin. You can't measure that in plans. Roberto's eyes were steel.
He had been taught, in boardrooms and by men who called markets the truest god, to regard sentiment as an old-fashioned tax on efficiency. He opened a folder and waved it like a flag against the setting sun. Either you step aside, or I'll step you aside. It's as simple as that. It was the simplicity of it, the reductive math that equated memory with an obstacle, that sealed the room into a silence so heavy the humming of a distant motorcycle seemed obscene. Antonia breathed, the sound small and shallow, as if the very oxygen had been taxed by the conflict. A door banged somewhere down the lane. A child cried. A woman in an upstairs window clapped a hand over her mouth and stared. The house, which had weathered decades of rain and joy alike, now felt like the hinge of a decision. You will give us time to think, Clara said. There was a tremor now, not in the resolve, but in the hurt. You promised that when we moved here together. Do you remember? You promised not to let business make us strangers. Roberto's face tightened as if at a taste he did not like. He shifted to the briefcase and withdrew an envelope, an official-looking notice in embossed script. He set it on the porch like an offering of irrevocable will. You've had time, he said. You've had plenty. This is what we agreed. The first block of this encounter had set its terms. The polished car, the briefcase, the plan, the cry of "leave now," a command and a prophecy at once. The crowd dispersed slowly after that, neighbors returning to their yards as if the ordinary rhythms of small-town life could stitch back some of what had frayed. But they carried the story with them like a bruise that refused to fade. If you value stories of family and second chances, consider subscribing. There are more like this one coming, each about people who must decide what to hold and what to let go. The lawyer's arrival was not immediate. There was an hour in which the family turned on itself in quieter ways. Inside, Clara opened a battered photo album and slid her finger across a picture of a small boy with scraped knees, Roberto, long ago, grinning toothlessly from an old bicycle. Antonio watched her. He had the look of a man cataloging loss, not empire-scale sorrow, but the precise ache that belongs to someone who feels the slow theft of a life he thought safe. When the lawyer finally appeared, neat, black-suited, with a professional expression that suggested clean hands, he carried more folders that smelled faintly of printer ink. He spoke in civil cadences and legal certainties that were meant to map the moment in incontrovertible logic. We filed the necessary notices, he explained, glancing at Antonia as if the older man's comprehension might need translation into terms of law. All procedures are in order. Clara's hands tightened on the album. Are you telling me they expect us to pack our lives into boxes because of a paper? She asked. The law is the law, Mrs. Costa, the lawyer said, as if repetition might lend it mercy. But there are options. There are arrangements. He offered a smile that was practiced and dry. Options, arrangements. They sounded like the polite names adults gave the collapse of real things. Antonio's shoulder sagged. He had built a fence around his world for years with sweat and learning, not with legalese. The notion that such a border could be dissolved by a thin sheet of paper written in a distant office felt almost obscene to him. Outside, copper light pooled across the yard. The tomatoes looked sunstruck, almost luminous. Roberto walked the edge of the garden as if inspecting an obstacle. He felt no pangs of nostalgia. The value he saw was clean. Land to be multiplied, profit to be realized, a future arranged in balance sheets. It is worth noting now the other threads beginning to fray. The margin calls that had started as sentences on a screen and turned into late-night phone calls, the partners whose smiles had once made calculations into a dance, now pressing for returns. And the quieter fissure in Roberto's marriage. Sophia had been altering the interior of their apartment, folding tiny clothes into drawers because the child she carried was expected.
She had also watched the man she loved shrink into meetings, into those late lunches that never gave a full account when he came home, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. She learned of the affair in a way that was almost casual, because the world is seldom dramatic in how it reveals betrayals. A receipt left on a counter, a line of messages that excused what could not be excused, a lipstick mark on a shirt cuff, small, stupid, indisputable. She confronted him in the quiet of their kitchen, the one place in the apartment that still felt like a home, rather than an office with soft linens. "You said we were honest," Sophia said. The light fell on her face, making the baby bumps curve even more luminous, an ordinary miracle rubbing up against an extraordinary rupture. Roberto's defense had always been a kind of corporate dialect, terms scrambled to sound like moral absolutes. "It's complicated, Sophie," he said, the nickname sticking because it always did. She had called him that through thinner times. "You don't see it from the inside. These are investments. These are opportunities." Sophia held up a bank notification. "Opportunities we're paying for," she said. The words did not need to be sewn into a greater tapestry. They lay simple and raw. Her voice carried the weight of a person who had entrusted not just marriage, but a future child's security to someone else's calculus. Roberto's responses grew shorter as the evening bled into a night of restless pacing. He tried to explain, but explanations are often scaffolding built to justify bridges one already crossed. He had trusted Viviane. Her laugh, the way she seemed eager to share not just his bed but his ambitions.
She had been a partner in more senses than one. She was also the sort of person who could turn a friendly strategy into an arrangement that benefited one side more than the other. When the first summons came, a terse email from a creditor, Roberto thought it a temporary flap, a gust that would pass. In his world, problems could be negotiated, contracts rewritten, obligations restructured. He reached for the phone, and for confidence in equal measure, dialing numbers that had always answered with a promise of rescue. That night, the calls multiplied. Margin call felt like a phrase that belonged to a distant market, until it began to appear on his screen like a small, persistent hornet. Partners pressed for capital. Banks required clearer collateral. A partner he had once thought loyal showed him the efficient face of risk, a terse request for reevaluation, and then, when he stalled, a polite withdrawal of support. In the quiet hours, Roberto's mind returned to the porch where his mother stood. He imagined his father's fingers on the banister. He could summon their faces as clearly as old photographs, but now they seemed to him like weathered props in a life that had been set someplace else. On the day the officer's letter arrived, an official, stamped envelope that did not ask permission but announced fact, Roberto's stomach turned the way it does right before a plane drops altitude. He read the notice in the taxi, the city unfurling around him like a map of contests. Penalty accrued here, a lien there. He thumbed through the paragraphs that reduced his empire to terms he could not wish away. When the official came in person, the violence of legality felt like the quietest kind. A man in a plain uniform who spoke with the little politeness trained into him by bureaucracy carried a clipboard and an air of inevitability. He listed items. He read off catalog numbers in tones that removed personality, as if converting a life into inventory. A cohort of men loaded a borrower's fate into boxes with the same care they might give to schedule an appointment. Roberto watched them take a laptop he had used to sign deals, the odd, expensive chair from the office, framed certificates that had once made visitors impressionable. The truck's back was a moving, humming stage where his life was consolidated into measured units. Clara and Antonio stood at the far end of their porch and watched all this unfold from what felt like outside history. For them, the seizure of things had a double edge. They were the parents of the man now dispossessed, and they were also the people whose own small life had almost been wiped out by the son's demand. Pride prickled along Antonio's jaw. He knew what loss felt like in the terms of having to start over. He had lived it, but he also watched the spectacle and felt something else. The sting of humility for his child, the ache of a parent who understands how often the past spills into the present. If there had been a moment to turn back, perhaps it would have been when the movers took the silverware and forklifted shrinking boxes onto the truck. Perhaps it would have been when Sophia left him at the doorway with a single bag and the echo of the word leave hanging like an accusation. But life rarely offers those clean reversals. Instead, it serves consequences with the bland face of a clerk. Roberto's nights grew hollow. He wandered the apartments of friends who now seemed less like allies and more like vantage points from which he could see better decisions. He took loans he could not afford against property that was marginal, and saw his credit erode as quickly as winter strips leaves from branches. His partners called with ever drier voices. Vivian, when she called, sounded distant. Her allegiance shifted to what preserved her own comfort. Betrayal, he learned, was not always the grand public denunciation he had imagined. Sometimes it was the slow, almost genteel erosion of support. In a small, rented room he picked as a stopgap, Roberto sat awake and listened to the gutters. He thought of the house, of the way his mother's hands had been raw with labor and stained with tomato juice. He held for a few seconds the faded picture from the mantel, himself at 8, smile wide, hair a mess from wind. The boy in the photograph did not look like the man who had shouted orders on a porch. The boy looked like one who had learned to ask for forgiveness and not keep the ledger of it. Then the summonses came with more teeth. Notices translated into men with clipboards and keys. Banks put red flags on accounts. The partners he had once called brothers filed paperwork that smelled of ink, but was otherwise as cold as the rest of the world. It became clear, with a clarity that hurt, that he had been twice betrayed, first by his own miscalculations, and second by the people whose warmth had never been more than convenience when the tide turned. The day the official came to the house was not cinematic. It was functional. A clipboard, a polite knock, a list read with a kind of detached thoroughness reserved for inventories. The movers came back to take what he had left: the car, the plaques, an instrument of work. The porch where he had once stood and declared restructuring plans now received the footsteps of strangers who placed cardboard boxes on the stoop with the correct amount of care. He stood there when the truck left, not because it made a noise that would strip him of memory, but because he needed to watch the same space that had been his stage finally fall into a different pattern. The neighbors watched. Mrs. Lourdes wiped a tear with her apron. Antonio and Clara did not speak. Their silence was an offering and a reproach all at once. When the house emptied, the sunlight on the porch looked like a spotlight on a stage that had been let go. Roberto's hands fumbled in his pockets. He felt the keys there, meaningless now, and he thought for a fraction of a second of the possibility of walking away, of leaving with the briefcase open and the world in it. Pride made him want to salvage an image. Fear made him tally losses. In that rawness, the one thing that remained was the memory of Clara's hands in the garden. He remembered the taste of a tomato she had given him as a child, the first tomato he had eaten straight off the vine, and how it had seemed then the most splendid thing a person could ever be offered. He remembered that the mango tree had been planted the summer he learned to read, and that Antonio had taught him to square the beams for a shed with the patience of a man showing how to take small acts and make them last. He did not, in that moment, go back to the house. He could have. He could have knocked and asked for entry, for a place to sleep under a roof that still remembered him as a boy. Instead, he sat on a curb and let the city light smear over him like a foreign language. The rest of the night unfolded in the thin ways loss often does: calls unanswered, cheap coffee, and the tender, terrible ache of a man who must find out what he is without the things that told him who he was. Not everything had been taken. Pride is stubborn and leaves debts beyond the bank's reckoning. It lodged in his throat and refused to be swallowed. Beyond the immediate loss, though, other questions began to press. How much had been squandered on the edge of ambition? Where did loyalty begin and opportunism end? And more pressingly, when the dust finally settled, what would remain to build again? At dawn, he found himself at the street that ran past his parents' home. He had not planned to go there. He told himself he would not yet cross the wooden gate. He would stand and consider the scene from a distance, measure, perhaps, the impact of what he had done. The porch was bare. The little mango tree cast a thin shadow. Mrs. Lourdes swept the sidewalk as she did every morning, methodical, at peace with the small tasks of keeping a neighborhood whole. Roberto almost turned away, but the door opened. Clara stood framed in the doorway, apron gone, hair loose around her face. In her hand she held a thermos and 2 cups. She did not speak before offering one to him. There was no theatricality in the gesture, only the steady, weary kindness of a person who has loved someone through their best and worst. "For tea," she said simply. "There's always tea." He accepted without thinking, the porcelain warm in his hands. It seemed like a small domestic miracle. The house had nothing inside but echoes and a few photographs. It had, however, the possibility of shelter and the immediate presence of people who knew his bones. Antonio came to the doorway then, smaller than his son remembered, but with a steadiness in his eyes that had always been mistaken for passivity.
He did not ask questions about the timing of the eviction or the legality of Roberto's choices. He said only, "You can come in. Sit." Roberto's mouth went dry. Admission carried a cost he had not been ready to pay: humility, apology, the naming of shame. He looked at the porch one last time before stepping across the threshold, and as he did, he felt a kind of weight lift. because it was, at least in that moment, replaced by something else, the simple relief of not being completely alone. The house was small and smelled of coffee and old wood. On the kitchen table lay a newspaper folded to an article about a local market. Clara set a plate of biscuits between them, the same ones Mrs. Lourdes had left the day he first screamed. She did not mention his outburst. She did not need to. Antonio sat with his hands wrapped around a new mug. They waited while he found the words to explain, while the city outside continued to move in rhythms he had thought he owned. Roberto began to speak. His voice was rough, unused to the tenderness he now had to touch. He told them about partners and loans, about margins and meetings that had emptied into miscalculations. He told them about the nights of shame and the moments when Vivian's voice on a phone became a compass pointing away from what mattered. He did not make excuses. He tried, in the forest of his confession, to find a straight path back to the child who had once knelt at Clara's feet to tie his shoes. Antonio listened the way he always had, without interruption, with a practical silence that managed to be both judgment and compassion. Clara held back tears, and then let them fall only when Roberto's voice broke and he could not go on. The sound of his crying in that little kitchen was not a spectacle. It was the sound of someone finally giving up the hard work of pretense and allowing grief to be the teacher it can sometimes be. That crying did not reset the world. No paper was magically rewritten, no checks were miraculously refilled, but it opened a door that had been shut by pride. It planted a seed of something that had seemed improbable: humility. Antonio stood and put a hand on Roberto's shoulder, not in admonition, but in the quiet way people touch others when they do not know how to say what their heart feels. "If you're willing," he said, "we'll find a way, not by promises from men who only think in profits, but by work. We'll start again." The offer was both practical and more than practical. It did not absolve Roberto of what he had done. It only gave him a place to be in the aftermath of his own choices, a place where he could begin to understand the texture of consequence. Outside, a car door slammed and then the distant hum of a van. The events of the city were not suspended for the tenderness of a family reconciling. Men with ties and suits continued their work, the gears of business humming without moral consideration.
Roberto knew there would be calls again, and letters, and visits from men who calculated his fall with the impartiality of actors reading from a script. But the immediate future offered him an impossible combination of things: debt and shelter, humiliation and dovetailing hands. He accepted tea. He sat in the worn chair and listened as Clara told him about the tomatoes that would need replanting, and about the child who had once dug the first hole with such enthusiasm that he had ruined the row. They did not lecture him. They described, in small domestic language, what care looked like. It was a kind of instruction he had never taken seriously before, a manual of the ordinary acts that combined create stability. Late that afternoon, as the sun rolled toward evening, a car pulled up the lane. It was not Roberto's car. Its presence was bureaucratic, sober, official. A man stepped out with a briefcase and a disciplined expression. He introduced himself with the sort of formality that suggested legal necessity rather than human curiosity. Dr. Henrique, the name on his card, moved with the speed of someone who believed in process and in the redemptive power of paperwork. He had come, he explained, as a mediator, someone who could translate bank terms into household language and propose arrangements that might soften the immediate blow. He spoke about deadlines and possible transfers, and about legal windows, small apertures through which a man could either fall or be steadied. Roberto listened not because he trusted his tone, but because the world had, in the last days, proved itself a place that required listening. Yet, as the conversation advanced into the early hours of the evening, it became clear that law and paperwork would not be enough. The debts were real. The obligations were immediate. The options Dr. Henrique offered were thin bridges over a wider chasm. When he left, he carried with him not the solace of solutions, but the fact of ongoing procedure. "We'll see what can be done," he said. The phrase was a way of handing a task back to time. It was both tender and non-committal. After he left, Roberto stepped onto the porch and looked up at the sky. The mango tree's shadow had grown long. Somewhere a child laughed. The house, stripped of its physical ornaments, held its memory like a patient heart. He felt the weight of choices press on him like a hand. He did not yet know how deep the fall would go. He did not yet know whether his wife would return, whether the products of misjudgment would be salvaged. He did not yet know that other truths, family secrets kept with tenderness, would soon arrive to complicate his calculations of self and inheritance. But something in him had shifted. The arrogance had curdled into a different currency. Where once he had only sought to extract value, he now felt a nascent hunger to understand worth. Even so, the road ahead was not a tidy moralizing arc.
There were creditors still to call, a partner to confront, and Vivian's intoxicating presence to reckon with. There were also neighbors who might not forgive, and the local press that took small-town drama and made it social plywood. The world outside the little porch would continue, indifferent to his inner repentance. And then, as evening folded into night, a knock echoed from the gate, sharp, purposeful. Roberto opened it to find a courier with an envelope so official it made his breath catch. It was not the letter of foreclosure. It was another thing, a notification from a legal firm in the city, brief and formal, about a different matter, one he had not expected, a document that hinted at elements of his past he had never fully examined. He held it in his hand and felt the paper's weight as if it carried inside not ink but a verdict. The house smelled of coffee and old wood, and the sweet, sun-warmed scent of tomatoes. Clara looked at him across the table and smiled the way a mother smiles when uncertainty has a child in its lap, with patience, with caution, with a hope that needs tending. Roberto stood at the threshold of two worlds, the world he had thrown himself into and almost destroyed, and the small, stubborn world that had kept him in its belly long enough to be remembered. He had lost much. He had not yet lost everything, but he no longer assumed the future belonged to him. He had to decide what, in the ashes of his choices, was worth saving. Beyond that knock at the gate, new papers began to arrive, papers that would not only enumerate debts, but also disclose truths and compel decisions. The evening pressed on, and with it came the sense that events were staging themselves not in single acts, but in a sequence of reckonings that would demand more from him than bravado. Inside the kitchen, the three of them sat in a kind of fragile truce. The light softened, the mango tree's branches shivered their last leaves into shadow. Roberto folded his hands around his cup and thought of the boy in the picture, of the scraped knees and of hands that never once demanded more than the family could give. He wondered quietly whether the only way to be a man he could respect was to learn at last how to rebuild from what was left. The courier's envelope sat on the kitchen table like a foreign coin, smooth, stamped, important. Roberto turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of other people's certainties. Clara watched him from the sink, rinsing a cup as if the motion might wash away whatever truth the paper contained. He slid it open with a fingernail. Inside was a short letter from a law office he had never heard of and a copy of a will. The handwriting on the will was decisive. It named a woman, his biological grandmother, an immigrant who had once run a modest tailoring shop in a different city, and it named him as a beneficiary of a trust established in her name.
The trust, the letter explained, was to remain in professional custody until the beneficiary reached 30. The letter did not promise immediate access. It explained in careful legal prose how the executor would proceed, the timeline, the tax implications, and the need for formal identification. It read like a bridge one could not cross without patience. It read like a possibility. Roberto's first thought was not of the money. It was a thin, private astonishment at being named in ink by someone he had never known. The second thought, quieter and more unwilling, was the number, the scale implied by the terse phrases used in the documents, and the sudden, dizzying arithmetic of what it could mean. "You're 30 soon?" Dr. Enrique had asked later, when he sat across the kitchen table with his pen tapping a rhythm over a legal pad. The room smelled of coffee and the tang of tomatoes cooling in the late sun. Antonio had been called in to listen. Their presence in the room had moved from being a comfort to becoming a witness. "Yes," Roberto said. The word sounded adult only when the documents confirmed it. The law, Dr. Enrique explained with professional caution, would take months to process, but it would proceed. The funds were not a magic wand. Taxes, evaluations, the executor's timeline, potential claims from distant relatives, all of these were roads that could slow or complicate the arrival of actual resources. But beyond the technicalities, there was a clear fact. Someone had chosen, on paper, to leave something to Roberto. That could change everything, Roberto said at last, and in the way he said it there was not only hunger, but the memory of how quickly things had been lost. Dr. Enrique nodded, pushing the plate of biscuits closer to him. "There's another thing," Dr. Enrique said, and his voice dropped as if shifting into a confidential channel. "A file was found, attached documents that suggest you are adopted." He watched Roberto's face as if watching the measurement of impact. "There's no deception in law. It's a fact to be acknowledged. If you want, I can make inquiries. If the trust is legitimate, we'll need to prove identity and accepted parentage to the executor.
The file will be sensitive. It will be between you and whoever you choose to bring in." That night, Roberto sat alone on the porch after the others had gone to bed. The mango tree made a dark script against the sky. He thought of the mother who had tied his shoelaces, the father who had taught him to square timber. Adoption was a word he had heard in stories. It had the tenderness of a secret handed down like a quilt, something to wrap a life. To him, it now felt like the hinge of an identity he had never suspected he needed. Viviana did not come back as a creature of melodrama. She arrived with a damp coat and a tired expression, the late rain still clinging to her hair.
She had come because she had been there in some of the early transactions, because she had access to records, because curiosity had a way of unraveling the guarded corners of business. She arrived with an awkwardness that suggested neither triumph nor evil intention, but a human mixture of self-interest and, perhaps, remorse. "I found these at a records office," she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. Her fingers brushed Roberto's for a moment. He did not pull away. The folder contained copies of the trust papers, and underneath them, a faded certificate of adoption signed by a solicitor. The adoption certificate named Clara and Antonio as legal parents decades earlier, a fact Roberto had half suspected and half resisted since the envelope had arrived. "This changes nothing about who raised you," Clara said when she learned. She had cleaned her hands before speaking, the gesture small and protective. "It only changes the name on a line." "But it could change everything else," Roberto replied. The sentence was not accusation, more bemused wonder, and a sorrowful tally of the ways paper claimed power. He had been raised by them. Their sacrifices had been the ledger that mattered. Yet the discovery opened a new landscape, a family branch he had never known, a name he had not carried, an inheritance that might make him whole again in ways his sweat and learning had not. Vivian's eyes were complicated. For a long time she sat in the kitchen and answered not with explanations but with fragments, an early friendship with a clerk at the records office, a curiosity that developed into a habit of reading public filings. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how," she said finally. I thought it might be leverage, or I don't know. I'm sorry." Her apology smelled like a human thing, small, insufficient, but real. It did not absolve what had happened between them. It merely changed the tone of what followed. Roberto felt the old anger flare and then recede, giving room to something like gratitude for the facts now revealed. But the facts were not a fast fix. Dr. Henrique was precise in the weeks that followed. The trust would require authentication. The executor would want clear proof of identity and lack of competing claims, and even if all was in order, the release of funds could be subject to delays and taxes. He suggested prudence. He insisted on a map of steps, an honest appraisal of creditors, and an orderly plan for what could be done now and what was reasonable to expect later. It was in the stretch between the revelation and the resolution that Roberto met the temptation of old habits. A brief call from a friend of friends offered a quick refinancing arrangement to bridge his liquidity problems, an infusion that would, practically and dangerously, involve transferring a small piece of what might become his to an offshore entity with beautiful brochures.
A late-night conversation with a broker suggested purchasing an undervalued property that would turn within months. The old language of opportunity swooned back into his ears like a lover trying to reclaim him. He said no. It was not a heroic act so much as a tired refusal. The next morning he walked the neighborhood instead. He stopped at Doña Lourdes's gate and helped her carry in a bag of vegetables. He went to the small hardware store and bought a bag of nails and, impulsively, a paintbrush. He sat in the backyard and watched the tomatoes and found the steadiness of their growth familiar and wise. The choice to refuse quick fixes had a practical contour. There was the legal reality that any rash conversion of potential assets into real ones could be seen as fraudulent by creditors. Dr. Enrique had been frank. Anything that looked like dissipating assets to avoid obligations could be contested. But there was also a moral contour. Whenever lists of numbers had conquered his life, relationships had been the casualties. He did not want to repeat that pattern. Instead, with Antonio's patient engineering and Clara's practical thrift, they did the work that steadied a household. Roberto learned to sand a tabletop until the wood's grains surfaced like a memory. He learned the grammar of a garden, when to prune, how to string a tomato plant to support its weight. He signed up for an evening class in small business accounting at the community college. He took, in short, the humbling route of work that mended trust in both practical and symbolic ways. Word traveled in gentle circles. Neighbors who had watched the spectacle of the porch and the truck's back now saw a different scene, the adult son sweeping the stoop, carrying water for Mrs. Lourdes when her knee flared. Small acts, repeated, made a new form of reputation. It did not restore the car or the plaques, but it restored the texture of belonging. Meanwhile, the legal steps continued. The executor, a careful woman with a lined face and patience that smelled faintly of lavender, began the process of validating the trust. She required documents, witnesses, proof of identity. There were bureaucratic hiccups, a missing signature from an old clerk who had retired, a notarization that had to be reissued, a distant cousin who filed a query. Each request meant delay. Each answer meant stoic negotiation. Sophia watched from a distance. She had stayed away in those early weeks, not because hatred glowed in her chest, but because the pain of betrayal had made the idea of home unbearable. She had packed clothes for the baby and herself into separate bags, and left with the exact ordinary dignity of someone who knew she deserved steadiness. But she also watched, because the tiny human inside her depended on choices no longer made by just one of them. One afternoon she returned with a careful knock on the kitchen door.
Her hands were folded across her stomach, not in defensiveness, but in a protective grace for the life she carried. She had come, she said, not to decide everything at once, but to bring back a jar of his favorite spice and to leave an invitation. Would he come meet her briefly at a coffee shop to talk about practical matters, for the child's sake? The meeting was shy, full of practical talk and the residue of grievance. They spoke of childcare, of names, of the lines that had eroded between them. Roberto did not ask for immediate absolution. He offered instead a plan. Very small steps, but consistent ones. He promised the truth and the transparency he had denied. Sophia listened, measured, and then in a small, cautious gesture that took both of them into unfamiliar territory, she allowed a door to open. Time, that patient arbiter, moved the story along. Months turned into a year in which Dr. Enrique shepherded the trust through probate and regulatory gauntlets. The executor's office called with updates. A final inventory had been completed. Tax implications were being assessed. There were a few legal fees to be handled. The numbers, when they finally came into view, were significant but not fantastical. They were enough to relieve certain burdens, to fund real work, to seed social investment, but they would not buy a fantasy of untroubled leisure. That was a useful, chastening fact. Roberto made decisions that surprised some who had watched him. Instead of buying back the car and restoring the symbols of his prior life, he invested in the house and in a small repair shop next door that would employ local youth. He used part of the dispersed funds to negotiate with his creditors in good faith. Dr. Enrique structured payments that acknowledged obligation while protecting the dignity of his parents and the community's pledge. He established a foundation, but not in the gilded showroom sense he might once have imagined. The foundation's charter was modest and precise, to provide small, sustainable grants to families facing eviction, to offer microloans for home repairs, and to found apprenticeships in carpentry, tailoring, and gardening for young people from the neighborhood. The board included Clara and Antonio, not as mere figureheads but as active members, and Dona Lourdes as a community advocate. Dr. Enrique acted as legal counsel to ensure compliance and transparency. What mattered to Roberto and to those who watched him was the way money was troubled by intent. A roof mended meant a family could stay. A young apprentice paid for tools and a class could learn a trade instead of selling time for nothing. A seed grant for Dona Margarita's household meant a child could sleep without the worry of leaking ceilings. The money became a means, not a trophy. There were inevitably critics. A columnist in the city paper wondered whether the transformation was sincere or a public relations maneuver. There were whispers, skeptics who thought old habits could be dressed in new rhetoric. Roberto accepted the skepticism as part of a public life. He could not control how others named his motives. He could, he decided, control what he built. The foundation's first project was small, repairing 5 homes in the neighborhood that were at risk of condensation and structural decay. The work was done openly. Volunteers came from the community college trade program. Small contractors donated labor in exchange for apprenticeship opportunities. Neighbors supplied lunches. The scene was not cinematic. It was messier and more honest. Paint on sleeves, calluses forming on inexperienced hands, cups of strong coffee shared between conversations about school fees and recipes. Yet out of that mess, the community's dignity was rebuilt.
brick by careful brick. One afternoon, Dona Margarita's house was finished. She stood on the threshold, her hands folded around a cloth she had used to knead dough for generations, and she cried. Her tears were not grand gestures. They were the release of a pressure she had endured for years. The foundation's small grant had not erased her past suffering, but it had given her a breathing space to plant again. She invited the volunteers into her kitchen, which, after the repairs, smelled of baked bread and newly hung curtains. The gathering was a small festival of ordinary things. Roberto learned new kinds of applause. Children, some of whom had once watched him with suspicion, now ran to him with questions about how to measure a board or how to graft a tomato plant. He realized how satisfying it felt to answer with patience rather than spin. Sophia, who had returned into their shared life with caution and a resolve to protect their child, smiled easily when she saw Roberto kneeling in a patch of soil teaching a teenager how to prune. The baby's first laugh became, in time, the sound that grounded him more than any summit had. There were public moments, too, measured and careful. The foundation's launch included a modest press conference on the porch of the house that had once been in question. Local journalists asked about the transformation. Roberto answered without flourish. He spoke of loss and obligation and the humility of work. He refused to make the story about himself, instead lifting the cases of lives that had been saved from the edges by things less dramatic than money, a neighbor's act of tenderness, a volunteer's spare afternoon. Money alone does not heal, he said. It helps repair what people already do. It buys time for a conversation, and it helps old hands teach young ones. The reporters wrote it down and looked for a harder line in his face, but found instead a man whose cheeks had lost some of their haughtiness. Over time, the house itself was changed. The porch was repaired, new paint applied in a color that Clara liked because it matched the old curtains she could never bear to throw away.
The mango tree grew new branches. A small workshop opened beside the house, a place where skilled hands taught apprentices how to mend, to make, to care for objects the way Clara had cared for jars and quilts. The workshop sign was simple: work that lasts. Not every relationship healed fully. Some deals could not be revisited. Some friends who had once been close remained distant. Vivienne moved away, seeking a fresh start in another city. Sometimes she wrote brief notes of apology. Sometimes she did not. The foundation, in a modest and awkward way, invited her to participate in a training program as a way of paying forward skills she had once used for her own quick wins. She accepted, and slowly the lines between contrition and action blurred. The years carved their steady path. The trust that had loomed like a possibility opened, and the funds were distributed in a way shaped by Roberto's new understanding of responsibility. He did not splash the money on spectacle. He used it to seed an endowment that would ensure the foundation's work persisted beyond the year-to-year scrutiny of benefactors. He set up an oversight committee, drawn from local residents, not distant advisors, so decisions about small grants would stay close to the lived realities of the people served. The practicalities were sometimes bureaucratic and often tedious. Forms, audits, the kind of meetings that make idealists frown, but they were necessary. They taught Roberto, in small increments, the difference between the bravado of a man who believed he could command outcomes and the patient craft of someone who knew systems mattered. One evening, with an old calendar thick with years behind him, Roberto sat on the porch and looked at the garden. The rows of tomatoes were not perfect. There were errors and gaps left where seasons had eroded energy, but they were thriving. Children from the apprentice program sat on the wall, passing around a plate of biscuits. The house felt, in a deep and quiet way, like a vessel that had weathered more than one storm and had been patched with care. Sophia leaned against him in a gesture that had the solidity of a repaired hinge. Their child, small now but steady, played at his feet with a wooden toy plane built in the workshop. Antonio and Clara watched from the kitchen window, hands folded in the ease of people who had, over decades, learned to be content with modest joys. Dr. Enrique dropped by with a stack of papers, this time bearing the cheer of successful negotiation rather than the chill of a summons. At the Foundation's 5th anniversary, the local paper ran a piece that called the project a small miracle of ordinary work. The headline irritated Roberto because it leaned toward melodrama, but he did not object. The story mattered less than the lives changed. A father who now had a job after learning carpentry. A single mother whose rent arrears were cleared so her children could finish the school term without fear. A group of youth who had learned to measure and plan and then used those skills to start small businesses. The most private restoration, however, came one quiet autumn afternoon. An elderly woman who had once been a neighbor and who had been one of the people most wounded by the early spectacle of the porch came to the house with a small basket of figs. She sat with Roberto on the back steps and told him, simply, that she had been wrong to think him a man without a heart. "I see now that losing what you did taught you how to give," she said. Her words were not absolution so much as recognition. It was the kind of gift that mattered most to him. Years later, when the city had been kinder to the small patch of land they called home, and when the foundation had a small but steady endowment, Roberto planted a sapling at the edge of the yard. The act had ceremony without show. His hands were dirty, his shirt rolled at the sleeves. Children from the workshop gathered around with the reverence one reserves for things that belong to a future one can barely know. Antonio knelt beside him, passing a trowel over and patting soil with a practiced gesture. Clara pressed a small palm against the dirt and laughed, an unadorned sound. Sophia held their daughter, no longer a baby, but a child with quick fingers pointing at bugs in the soil. She whispered something into the child's ear, and the child laughed, the noise like a bright punctuation in the yard. The sapling was thin, a hopeful stick of green. Roberto placed his hands around it and felt, in the ordinary pressure of fingers and dirt, a completion of sorts. "Remember the tomatoes," he said to the children, and they loved him for the reference. "They take patience." He looked at the porch where he had once stood demanding and iron-willed, and now saw instead a life shaped by persistent smallness. The house did not glimmer like a trophy. It shone in the way things do when tended by real hands. There were days when he replayed the exact sound of his voice on that afternoon so many years back, the brittle command that had stunned a street. He could still see his polished shoe on the gravel, the briefcase presented like a cabinet of claims. He could feel, like an old scar, the adrenaline that had powered him then. The memory stung less in proportion to how much work had been done to create a new center. On the porch that evening, with the sapling committed to dirt and the kids' laughter rising around them, Roberto spoke not as a man who had been vindicated, but as a man who had learned how fragile each life is and how generous hands might be used to protect fragility. "I lost everything," he said quietly to Antonio and Clara, who were close enough to hear. His voice had no show in it, only fact.
"I lost what I thought made me who I was." Antonio did not look surprised. He had watched the whole arc and had always known the measures of life's currency. "You found something else," he said simply. Clara reached out and folded Roberto's hand with both of hers. "You found what we always wanted you to hold," she said. "Not papers, not promises, people." Later, when the reporters wanted a neat moral that could be typed in a headline, Roberto resisted the impulse to make his life a tale of dramatic repentance. He said instead that mistakes are not erased by money, and that losing everything had been the painful tool that showed him what to build. He insisted on the modesty of the foundation's aims and on the hard work that made its results durable. The foundation continued, funded by careful stewardship and the modest generosity of people who had once been skeptical. It helped families, repaired houses, taught trades, and kept a small office in the neighborhood so the work was visible and accountable. It did not remove the stains of past errors, but it altered the arc of future ones by creating structures that allowed people to stay in their homes and to learn skills that mattered. Years later still, a child with flour on her fingers, a granddaughter, if you used the family's new language, tugged at Roberto's sleeve. She wanted to plant a tomato seed. He crouched with her. The wooden trowel fit in his hand the way it had once fit in Antonio's. Together they placed the seed in the dark and patted the earth over it. The child's face, intent and untroubled, looked up at him as if the future were an invitation. He remembered the hiss of his car tires on gravel, the briefcase opened like an accusation, the voice that had once ordered the people who loved him out into the sun. He remembered the truck backing away with his measured life stowed in boxes. But mostly he remembered the small hands that had replanted him, the voices that had said there's always tea, and the rows of tomatoes that taught him patience and stewardship. In the end, the public might prefer a neat epilogue, the wealthy son who learned humility, the dramatic fall and sudden redemption. The truth was less tidy. He had lost everything the day the truck left, and in that losing he discovered that some kinds of wealth, those built of repaired trust, of consistent work, of community, were harder to spend and richer in effect. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are built as much by small hands as by grand gestures, and consider supporting local initiatives that help families rebuild.